Picture this, it's the late 18th century, and two colossal powers are on a collision course for control of the Indian subcontinent. On one side, you have the ambitious British East India Company, and on the other, the vast Maratha Empire, the last great Indian power standing in their way. But in less than 50 years, that empire would just vanish. So how did that happen? Let's get into this story of ambition, betrayal, and total collapse.
And that's the big question here, right? How could a sprawling empire, with so much manpower and all that territory, fall so completely and so fast? The answer, you'll see, isn't just about battles and guns. No, it's about politics, fatal flaws, and a few moments of sheer strategic genius.
All right, let's set the stage. By the 1770s, the East India Company had a solid grip on Bengal and parts of the south. But to really control India, they knew they had to face the dominant force of the time, the Marathas. A clash was, well, pretty much inevitable.
Okay, this is where it gets really interesting. Look at the difference in how these two powers were built. The Marathas, they had the home field advantage. We're talking massive territory and a huge population to draw soldiers from. The British, on the other hand, had this incredibly disciplined, modern army with a crystal-clear unified chain of command. But the Marathas' greatest strength was also tied to their fatal flaw. They weren't really a single unified empire.
See, they were a confederacy. Think of it as a collection of powerful chieftains, like the Scindias, the Holkars, and the Bonsles. Now, technically, they were all under the leadership of the Peshwa in Pune, but in reality, they were fierce rivals, always jockeying for more power and more influence. And this internal division, you guessed it, would become the perfect lever for the British to use against them.
So how did this internal backstabbing first play out? Well, it all kicks off with the First Anglo-Maratha War. And what's wild is that the first crack in the Maratha Empire didn't come from a British invasion, but from a betrayal deep within their own ranks.
The whole thing started when this one ambitious Maratha noble, Raghunath Rao, got passed over for the throne of the Peshwa. So what does he do? He goes straight to the British in Mumbai and signs the Treaty of Surat, basically offering them territory in exchange for their army helping him become Peshwa. This, of course, sparks the war. But the Marathas, under the brilliant commander Mahaji Shinde, actually united for a moment and handed the British a seriously humiliating defeat at Wadgaon.
So in the end, the war wraps up with the Treaty of Saubai, which was a clear political win for the Marathas. They forced the British to recognize their guy as Peshwa, and it bought them 2 decades of peace. On the surface, it really looked like they had put the British back in their box. But even though it was a victory, the war had exposed a really dangerous truth. A powerful Maratha leader was willing to sell out his own people for a shot at personal power. For 20 years, that tense peace somehow held, but underneath, those internal rivalries inside the Confederacy, they only got worse. And in the Second Anglo-Maratha War, those rivalries would finally, fatally, break the empire. The spark this time was the new Peshwa, Baji Rao II, who was known for being a pretty weak and ineffective leader. After he gets defeated in a battle by a rival Maratha clan, the Holkars, the terrified Peshwa flees, and where does he run? You guessed it, straight into the arms of the British, making a decision that would absolutely seal his empire's fate. He signed something called a subsidiary alliance. Now you've got to understand, this was the key British tool for dominating India. It sounded like a protection deal. And, well, it was basically a protection racket. An Indian ruler would get protection from British troops stationed in their territory. But, and this is the critical part, they had to pay for those troops and give up all control of their foreign policy. It was literally trading your independence for personal security. And that's the impact, right there. By signing the Treaty of Bassein, the leader of the entire Maratha Confederation had basically invited the fox into the henhouse. He had legally surrendered Maratha sovereignty. The other Maratha chieftains were, of course, outraged and declared war on the British, but it was too late. The British now had the legal paperwork to be there. Now, the key battle of this war was at a place called Asai, and the numbers here are just mind-boggling. The combined forces of the Shinde and Bonsle clans had around 40,000 troops. They were facing a British force, led by a young Arthur Wellesley, yep, the future Duke of Wellington, of less than 10,000. I mean, on paper, this should have been an absolute slaughter. But it wasn't. The disciplined British army won a stunning, decisive victory. So how is that even possible? Well, because the Maratha Confederacy wasn't united. The powerful Holkar clan, who were bitter rivals of the Shindes, just sat the battle out.
The Marathas couldn't bring their full strength to bear because they were fighting each other just as much as they were fighting the British.
Okay, so the Second War absolutely shattered Maratha power and prestige. The final act, the Third Anglo-Maratha War, was less a war and more of a mopping up operation. It was led by a new aggressive governor-general, Lord Hastings, who was determined to establish absolute British supremacy once and for all.
And Hastings' strategy was just methodical. First, he uses a campaign against some mercenaries called the Pindaris as an excuse to move massive armies deep into Maratha territory. Then, before a single shot is even fired in the main war, he uses that military presence to bully the remaining Maratha chiefs into signing even more restrictive treaties, basically stripping them of their power and isolating the Peshwa.
The Peshwa Baji Rao II, he finally realizes what a colossal mistake he's made and decides to make one last desperate stand. He gathers a massive army at Khadki, near Pune. Some estimates put his infantry alone at over 50,000 men.
And who are they facing? Get this, a tiny British contingent of just 1,200 soldiers. Again, the numbers are just staggering. It seems completely impossible for the British to win this fight. Which brings us to the obvious question. I mean, with that kind of overwhelming numerical superiority, how on earth did the Marathas suffer another catastrophic defeat?
Well, the answer comes down to a complete and total failure of leadership. I mean, just imagine being one of those 50,000 soldiers. You're ready to fight for your empire, only to discover your leader, Peshwa Baji Rao II, isn't even on the battlefield. His absence just shattered morale. He completely ignored the sound advice from his competent generals, and the result was this massive, uncoordinated force that just fell apart against a small but very disciplined and well-led enemy. And that was the end. After the defeat, Baji Rao II was hunted down, and he surrendered. The British abolished the position of Peshwa forever, pensioned him off, and exiled him far away from his homeland. The Maratha Empire was officially over.
So when we look back at the collapse of this truly great power, what are the final takeaways? What really brought down the Maratha Empire?
So what's the bottom line here? It wasn't just that the British army was better. No, it boils down to a few key things. First, and this is the big one, their fatal disunity. That constant infighting was just masterfully exploited by the British. Second, you had catastrophic leadership from men who put their own ambition and safety way ahead of their empire's survival. Third, a total lack of central command, which meant they could never bring their full, massive strength to bear. And finally, a political failure of epic proportions, signing away their own sovereignty piece by piece.
And there's one last fascinating piece to this whole story: how we know it. You see, much of the first comprehensive history of the Marathas wasn't written by them. It was written by a British officer named James Grant Duff, who was the political agent in the region right after the empire fell. Which really speaks to that old saying,
that history is written by the victors. Duff's account, written from the perspective of the East India Company, shapes the narrative for generations, and it leaves us with a final question to think about. When we study the fall of any great power, are we really reading the objective truth, or are we just reading the victor's justification?